I will be the first one to admit that sometimes it is a challenge to find daily content to provide here on YouTube that is both informative, important, and relative to your life. Content that you can come away with something new you didn't have before. There's a lot of content that is very derivative, meaning people commenting on other people commenting on something else that everybody knows about. Today is not one of those days. What's going on right now in the White House has a lot of people scratching their heads, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on because we have failed to teach history properly in this country. Now, what am I talking about? Many have said, Florida Maquis, have you not heard about the rail strike? Why aren't you covering it? Well, it's very simple. This was settled 100 years ago. If there had been any real true threat of a rail strike, the military would have been activated a long time ago. You would have had more stories about National Guard engineering units standing up to operate the railroads. It was settled 100 years ago that it is a matter of national security. Hence the law that was invoked, that Congress said, this is now going to be your contract, labor union for the railroad, and you are going to accept it, and you're going to go back to work, and you're going to shut up. And there's a lot of labor unions out there saying, how could Biden have done this? He's one of us. He's a Democrat. He's a leftist. He's pro-labor. And a lot of people on the right are scratching their heads going, that's interesting. What is this all about? Well, you see, this is true socialism, and it proves something. It proves something that I have been talking about regarding South America and this country for a long time. For those of you that are unaware, Biden signs bill averting rail worker strike despite lack of paid sick days. You mean wait a minute, hold on. How can the government intervene in this event? How can they make it be so that there is now a contract? Well, it's law. It's the Labor Relations Act of 1926 that gives the president the authority to intervene as well in situations where a rail strike could significantly affect essential transportation. The act has been invoked 18 times since it was signed into law. And the unions are just having a fit about it. No to capitalist politicians. Hey, quick poll, show of hands. How many people out there would have labeled Joe Biden a capitalist and not a socialist? Oh, but it gets better. It gets even better. What if I told you that the reason the law exists has to do with this young lady? Some of you might not know who she is because it really doesn't matter who she is. She's emblematic of what was happening 100 years ago that caused this. Ladies, I would like to ask you a question. Let's say you're married and you have a husband and he's home every night at 5:30 and you have dinner ready. And you have conversation and the kids are there. And things are wonderful. But one day, he doesn't show up. And you don't know where he is. And you remember before you were married, he had this favorite watering hole that he would frequent when he was single. And so you decide to take the kids over to the neighbors real quick and go down and see if he stopped off for a beer with the boys. And lo and behold, there he is, standing at the bar, having a conversation with this woman. Now, nothing biblical is going on, but I'll bet a lot of you would have been annoyed. Maybe some of you might be a little more than annoyed. Well, 100 years ago, Christian moral women who had just gotten the newly minted right to vote, they were incensed because this is what capitalism had led to. See, capitalism and having more money and time on their hands than what they needed left men with other options. And there were lots of women out there that realized this. Now, we're going to get a lot farther into this because going down this road, I'm sure, is something that is only appropriate for Patreon. $1 per month if you would like the rest of that story and why we have laws, pardon me, adjusting the camera, why we have laws that allow Congress to intervene in the affairs of business. You see, there's a social aspect to it. Statement from President Joe Biden on House action to avert rail shutdown. I am grateful to Speaker Pelosi and House Democrats and Republicans for taking urgent action to prevent a rail shutdown. This overwhelming bipartisan vote in the House of Representatives makes clear that Democrats and Republicans agree that a rail shutdown would be devastating to our economy and families across the country. The Senate must now act urgently. Without the certainty of a final vote to avoid a shutdown this week, railroads will begin to halt the movement of critical materials like chemicals to clean our drinking water as soon as this weekend. Let me say that again. Without action this week, disruptions to our auto supply chains, our ability to move food to tables, and our ability to remove hazardous waste from gasoline refineries will begin. The Senate must move quickly and send a bill to my desk for signature immediately. Now, those of you still hanging on to this ridiculous nonsense notion that you live in a capitalist country, and that it's now the job of the U.S. to export capitalism to places like Venezuela for freedom and liberty and democracy. And you're just deluded. The government has taken control of every major important industry in a way that doesn't really leave fingerprints on the surface. But when you look into history, especially the turn of the last century, from the 1890s to the 1920s, capitalists nearly destroyed this country. Caused the Great Depression, by the way. Caused the starvation, caused the problem. It wasn't socialism. But to refer back to what we're going to talk about at Patreon, there were Christian moralists that stood up and said, enough's enough. And I'll even show you the article. There's an article out there right now that covers this. We've covered it before. Some of you might remember. That says there was a time when devout evangelical Christians were 100% socialists. Because that was the command. That was the command of the Bible. Don't allow this kind of greed to take over the day and cause problems and cause issues. Well, for 30, 40 years, in this country, maybe almost 50, robber barons and railroad magnates almost bought Europe. No lie. They got so rich and so wealthy. By the way, this is a map of U.S. railroad lines. This is why it is a matter of national security. They were so rich. They were so powerful. Comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, there's no modern billionaire that comes even close to the amount of power and the amount of control that the robber barons and the railroad magnates had in the 1900s, late 1800s and 1900s. They literally controlled pretty much every aspect of daily life because everything that was bought or sold moved by rail. And they did. They got insanely wealthy. Same thing with the highway system. A lot of people don't realize what we call the Eisenhower, or the interstate system, was technically called the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. Matter of national security. The movement of goods back and forth. See, our military doesn't have its own farms. Our military doesn't grow its own food. So to keep the military fed 3 meals a day, to keep gasoline in the tanks of, well, the tanks, so to speak, they got to have everything flowing, everything moving, everything's got to be, it's a matter of national security. So there's no labor union going to say, we want this and we want that and we want the other. You see, Biden is the last of an era. He's the last of the old blue dogs. Him and Manchin and who was the guy from Daschle from up in the Dakotas, Byrd. Even honestly, Al Gore. Al Gore and Al Gore's father, Tipper Gore, wanted to ban rap music. That's how conservative they were. But they had an idea about society and the protection of society and the operation of society. And there's a long list of them. And those of you wondering about the military can run our railroads. Just look it up. There's absolutely, if there were any real threat, the military would have been alerted a long time ago. That's why I never covered this. But now that he has signed this piece of paper, it really should make a lot of you scratch your heads. Thomas Durant, Union Pacific, run by this guy, after 3 years and a cost of more at the time of $500,000, the Union Pacific only laid 40 miles of track. That's how much he was soaking the government for. Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, Crocker. And down here in Florida, literally everything has Henry Flagler's name on it. And he created the railway from Jacksonville all the way out to the Keys. I live in Flagler County. In St. Augustine, the biggest college is Flagler College. Everything's Flagler this, Flagler that, Flagler the other. But this was what happens, or what happened, I should say, 100 years ago. When all of a sudden, massive amounts of money started flowing in to very wealthy men who made other men who scratched their backs and were yes men, made them wealthy men. And then in turn, they made other men very wealthy men for very little work. And what happens when you have men who have more money than what they need and more time on their hands? Guess what? You think this is new? This is History Channel from 2017, talking about the 1920s flapper era, the scandalous parties that made Americans hate flappers. But a lot of people didn't ask, where did the flappers come from? Where did they come from? Well, guess what? There was a backlash. There was a huge backlash. Big business banishes the flapper. Her dress and deportment are now toned down as banks and corporations adopt regulations dooming the vampy types on the left. The vampy types on the left in favor of the demure ones on the right. See, this was scandalous, all this calf. All this calf and all this feathery hat nonsense. And if you really want a deep dive into the politics of the 1900s and 1890 to 1930, go dust off the Monopoly game. How many of you had anyone in your family, or did you figure out the magic formula to winning Monopoly every time? There are 29 squares that can be owned on this board. You only need to have 8 of them. If you have those 8, you will never lose. You know what those 8 are? All you have to have are the 4 railroads that are in the center of each side of the board. Those 4. And then all you need is the electric company, the waterworks, that makes 6, Park Place, and Boardwalk. That's all you have to have. Try it. Get the Monopoly board out and make your strategy be just the 4 railroads, just the utilities, and the 2 most expensive places. And let everybody else have everything else. And you will win every single time without fail. Monopolizing the utilities, monopolizing the rail system. It's exactly what's going on. See, the reason we have the Railway Labor Act is to keep people from doing this. The Railway Labor Act, United States federal law on U.S. labor law that governs labor relations. They cannot have people based on their little whiny wants and needs. And some might say, how dare you call paid leave whiny? Well, guess what? Compared to holding the rest of the country's goods hostage, it's whiny. You don't have that kind of power. Unions, a lot of people think the unions run everything. Apparently not. But that's going to be one of those cognitive dissonance moments. Gosh, I really thought Joe Biden was in the pocket of the socialists. And if he was, he would necessarily always side with the unions, wouldn't he? Why would he come out and invoke and encourage Congress to invoke this on the side of the capitalists? Why would he do that? Kind of makes you scratch your head. If like, well, Biden wanted to, if Biden wanted to destroy America, it would have been real easy to go run right into the arms of his own party on this and say, nope, I am taking a stand for the unions. I am not going to allow, if they try to invoke this National Labor Relations Law from 1926, this archaic piece of legislation, I am going to veto it. See, if he wanted to do that, he could. But he didn't. And that's going to make a lot of people scratch their heads. But it really has something more to do with a different kind of socialism. A moral level of socialism that not many people are used to. A lot of people think socialism, they think government control and money. Socialism in this country, especially where this guy comes from, and he's 80 years old, had a moral tinge to it. That's why I find it so odd. I find it so strange to hear Christians, modern day Christians, talk about capitalism in such glowing terms. Your great-grandparents would be rolling over in their graves hearing you talk as a Christian about capitalism. To them, it was literally Satan on earth, capitalism. Socialism meant your husband's coming home because there ain't a bar to stop at. There ain't women drinking and dressed like that in those bars because people ain't got the money. And that's good. Vows of poverty are a good thing. Having just what you need and anything more, you either give it to the poor or you give it to God, you give it to the church. And they could sure open up the first 5 books of the New Testament, and they could talk about Jesus and the apostles and how they lived and how they threw everything together. If somebody had need, somebody sold something and gave it to them. They had a lot of scripture on their side for a type of socialism that was the way of life in this country all the way up until about 100 years ago. But once again, to get into this, gets a little dicey for YouTube because it gets ugly when women got the right to vote. Boy, I tell you what, they came down like a 9-pound hammer on politics. And they put a huge wave of socialists and moralists into office before World War II. That's why during World War II, we had all those socialist policies, food stamps, and just like the Patriot nurse, when she was interviewing her grandfather, and the grandfather related to her that his uncle had sold his shoe stamp because he didn't feel the boy needed shoes, and that was a big no-no back then, taking government-issued stamps for this, that, and the other and selling them on the black market. That was a big no-no back then. You see, it was a very, very different group of people who said that you should willingly and happily pay taxes, and that you should only take your ration and what's being given to you as a matter of patriotism. You see, those were the Christians, those were our great-grandparents, and maybe for some of you, great-great-grandparents. That was their version of the world, their version of moralism. And what you're looking at right now on your screen was the greatest threat to it. And boy, they dropped the hammer, and the booze and the parties and the leftist, liberal, laissez-faire way of doing things, the get rich as fast as you can, any way you can, capitalism version of America, they loathed it. And it doesn't matter whether it was from the Dutch, the Amish, the Mennonites, the modern Dutch, honest to God, are a bunch of heathens compared to 100 years ago. 120 years ago, when this law that was just invoked was passed. It's all tied together, guys. It's a lack of history. It's a lack of understanding history and what running a country was really all about. These guys, these robber barons, if they had their way, they would own Europe. We would be living under kings and queens again. This entire idea of voting was completely antithetical Completely antithetical to the world they envisioned. And these guys like Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker, they make Bezos and Musk and Tim Cook, they make them look like paupers for the amount of power and control. Yeah, in dollars, in valuation. How they valued somebody's wealth back then was very different than how they value it now. So believe me, these guys were way more powerful. So anyway, I will leave it there. But if you want the rest of the story on this, join us over at Patreon. Trust me, it gets ugly. It really gets ugly. It's probably too much, way too much for YouTube. It's $1, even less if you sign up for an entire year. Great time to join right here at the beginning of the month so you get your whole max amount. You don't have to pay for the partial month. $1, even less if you sign up for an entire year, fully refundable. If you go over there and the story is not what you think it is, and the video will be up in the next 24 to 72 hours. I want to put it together and make it completely right. You can get your dollar back. Believe me, capitalists of the early 20th century would not have given you a money-back guarantee. Wasn't in their modus operandi. So, anyway, love to have you over there. We've already got lots and lots of folks. Thank you so much. Very much appreciate it. 2 December 2022, Friday, 17:34 hours. That is 5:34 p.m. in the afternoon or evening, I guess, for those of you in the civilian world. Currently 71, high of 79, low of 66. No rain, no wind. Barometer 30.33. God bless. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time.